we're adding another factor to look at here. So it's becoming more and more like a division order pay sheet. So because in this case, we want to know what the net revenue interest is of co-tenants, that is, people that own in the same piece of property, but they own it jointly. So each owns a percentage, like a 50-50 or 25-25-25. And then there's going to be different royalty interest, and it's also going to be in a spacing unit. So let's look at, so you'll remember that when we talked about spacing units, what we said was that you take at the time it was just the royalty interest times the tract acres divided by the unit acres. Well, now that we know that it could be owned by, it's not always 100%, now we can add in what the mineral interest is. So our formula is the royalty interest times the mineral interest times the tract acres divided by the unit acres, and that's going to be our net revenue interest. So let's look at problem 1, which is Mike Brady owns 160 acres in the northwest quarter of Section 6. Upon his death, his property passes to his 4 children, Greg, Peter, Bobby, and Cindy, who each own a 25% undivided interest in the 160 acres. Marshall Drilling separately leases, so every person has a separate lease. They've been negotiated separately from each heir. Greg leases for a 1/4 royalty, Peter leases for a 3/16 royalty, Bobby leases for a 1/8 royalty, and Cindy leases for a 1/8 royalty. Now we're adding the additional factor that a well is drilled by Marshall Drilling in a 320-acre drilling unit. So now we're going to have to reduce what their royalty rate is, or what their net revenue interest, reduce it by their actual mineral interest, and reduce it by the number of tracts that they have there that are in the actual unit. By the way, in an oil and gas lease, Greg's lease would show that he owns 160 acres. That lease would not designate whether he owned 25%, whether he owned 50%, or what his percentage of interest is. That's something that the landman or the broker will know as a result of running the chain of title. But when these leases are received in lease administration, for example, the only way we know what these mineral interest is on something called a lease purchase report. And the lease purchase report will say what their actual mineral interest or mineral ownership was in this property. So if you look at just the lease and it says 160 acres, you might assume that Greg owns 100%. That would be incorrect. You still have to look at this lease purchase report to find out what his interest is. Okay, so now let's look at this particular problem, and let's just fill in as many of these blanks as we can to come up with the proper net revenue interest, and then we'll look at it on a division order spreadsheet, or rather an Excel spreadsheet. All right, so right away we know what everyone's royalty interest is. So Greg leases for a 1/4 royalty, which is a 0.25. Peter leases for 3/16, which is a 0.1875. Bobby leases for 1/8, that's a 0.125. And then Cindy leases for a 1/8, that's a 0.125. Now we all know that they own an equal 25% undivided interest. So their mineral interest for each of them is going to be the same, 25%, 0.25 decimal. So already we know that we need to multiply the royalty interest by the mineral interest. That's what we did in the last chapter. But now we're adding this new step. Now you already know how to do this because we covered it in an earlier chapter, but you don't know how to do it when there's different royalties. So let's look at the tract acres is 160 acres. And so you say, well, why don't we divide this by 25 to show their mineral interest? Well, that's captured here in this part of the formula. And by keeping it separate, it helps you know if there's a mistake where you can go back and look at it. So 160 over 320 is the drilling and spacing unit, 320. And so we can just look at that and know that that's a half. 160 and 160 equal 320. So that's going to be a 0.5. And that's what's going to equal our net revenue interest when we calculate this out. So let's look at it. We're going to say the royalty interest is a 0.25 times the mineral interest, which is their 25%, 0.25, times the tract acres, which is 160, divided by the unit acres, and that gives a 0.03125 interest for Greg. So then let's look at, let's label these. This is Greg, Peter, Bobby, and Cindy. So then let's look at Peter's interest. Remember, he had a 3/16 royalty interest. So his interest is going to be a 0.1875 times a 25% mineral interest times the tract acres divided by the unit acres. That's a 0.0234375. 0.0234075. Sorry, no, 0.0234375. Then we look at Bobby, and Bobby and Cindy's is the same. So this will be, we'll just need to do this for one of them. And so Bobby's interest is a 0.125. 0.125 royalty interest times a 25% mineral interest times the number of acres in the lease tract divided by the total unit acres. Messed up. Okay, let's start over. 0.125 times 0.25 times 160 times 160 divided by 320. Okay, this is why we want to use a spreadsheet. So let's go to our spreadsheet. And we'll just plug in these numbers. Now, I've already kind of set it up here. So I've shown you what their different royalty interests are and what their mineral interests are. So now what we plug in here is the tract acres, which is the 160. And then we plug in the unit acres in the next column. And then that allows us to then input this formula. So now I've written it out for you here. So you're going to really copy this, but you're going to have to go back to the cell that says royalty interest, the cell that says mineral, the cell that goes tract. So remember, you always start with the equal sign. So I'm going to start with the royalty interest, and I'm going to multiply that by the mineral interest. Let me start over. Equal royalty interest. I'm scooting over with my keys, arrow keys, times 0.25 times 160 divided by 320. and that is going to be his 0.03125, which is the same thing we got over here. But now instead of having to separately calculate everybody's interest, we can just take this tab here, and when it makes the skinny plus sign, you just scroll that down, and then that gives you all the different interest. So you see we got a 0.0234375 for Peter, and for Bobby and Cindy it's a 0.015625. So I'm just going to write that in here. So that is the advantage of using Excel. It allows you to calculate it easier, and it allows you to see exactly what you input into those cells. Okay, let's move on to the next problem then.